Hello and welcome. It's great to have so many people here. If you're just out in the cafe, do come on in, find a seat, sit down. We'll be hosting you for the next hour or so. I'm Joel, it's lovely to see you all.
Hi everyone, I'm Priscilla.
And we're going to have a short talk from Chris, not Steve, in a moment. He's going to come up, and then after that we'll have a chance for some questions as well.
Yes, we'll be having another Q&A. We have a Slido place where you can ask your questions. So just type in Slido to Google, and the code is 194972, I believe. So, Chris, can I invite you up? So, Chris, we've learnt so far about you that you are from Durham.
Yes.
Is that right? From a church in Durham. On Monday we learnt that you'd been on Pointless.
That is correct.
And actually won.
Yes.
Yesterday we learned that you were a child model.
Yes, and people are still sniggering. No, I wore a very nice mustard jumper. Is it not more believable now?
Chris, is there any other interesting fact that we don't know about you?
No, that's pretty much it. Those are my two interesting facts. No. What will I say? Very recently, I was appointed by the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales as a magistrate in England and Wales. So officially, if I was to really hand myself up, I should have a big slide up here that doesn't say otherwise. It should be Chris Roussel, JP. And I can stick some more letters after my name. You know, there you go. Something you might not have known about me just by looking at me.
They keep on coming. Amazing.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone, welcome to Wonder. Hello again if you are returning. It is great to see some familiar faces. And if this is the first time that you've joined us this week, it's so good to have you with us. On Monday lunchtime we were thinking about questions of science and faith, and yesterday lunchtime we were exploring questions about well-being and mental health. And today, today it seems is where the rubber really hits the road. Because today we are thinking about suffering. And it feels like the rubber really hits the road when we talk about suffering, because suffering seems to be the most definitive and universal part of the human experience. The best-selling author Yuval Noah Harari, in his second book, Homo Deus, said this of suffering. He says, how do you know if an entity is real? Very simple. Just ask yourself, can it suffer? When people burn down the temple of Zeus, Zeus doesn't suffer. When the euro loses its value, the euro doesn't suffer. In contrast, when a soldier is wounded in battle, he really does suffer. When a famished peasant has nothing to eat, she suffers. This is reality. See, for Harari, suffering itself is the marker of reality, and the fact that suffering seems to be so ubiquitous means that it is the fundamental aspect of reality, at least according to Harari. It seems inescapable. Some of you in your lives might already faced great suffering, and some of you in this room may well be dealing with that now. It seems fundamentally true that at some points in our life, we'll be faced with a deep and profound suffering. Happy Wednesday. And the question, when these times come, the question will no doubt pass our lips. Why? Why is this happening to me? So if you allow me, I'd like to open this can of worms. And as with all discussions about suffering, this isn't just an interesting philosophical puzzle to ponder, but actually speaks of a deep existential cry from within. Why? Why has this happened? How can I make sense of it? And what I'm going to suggest over the next 20 minutes or so is that the Christian story offers us the best resources to make sense of our suffering. Or to rephrase it slightly, in knowing Jesus, our question, why, finds its most satisfying resolution. But before I begin to really delve into the topic, I actually want to start a little bit further back. Because when discussions around God and suffering occur, it's kind of framed as a problem, the so-called problem of suffering. And so I want to begin by pondering not the problem of suffering itself, but by asking why it's a problem. And I mean this in two ways. I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about why the 21st century West feels the problem of suffering so acutely. Why are we so troubled by suffering in our world today? But I also want to think about the language of problem. Why is suffering a problem, and who is it a problem for? So, why does the West feel suffering so acutely? Well, it's going to sound incredibly tangential, but I would argue it's to do with the meaning of life. This is the French philosopher Loic Ferry, and he posited that the 21st century West lacks what he calls a meta-meaning, a meaning of meaning. This is very esoteric, but go with me. What he means by this is there are things in our lives that we find purposeful. We undertake various projects, we engage in activism for just causes, maybe we find a career that we see as valuable, maybe we start a family and raise children to become healthy and flourishing adults who lead lives of their own. We do these things because we think they're meaningful. But what Ferry says is that if we're pressed, if we're really pushed, we can't articulate why they're meaningful. We get the sense, we feel that they're meaningful, but when we're pressed, we can't explain why. I have 3 siblings, and I'm not a parent myself, but I can sense the deep joy that my dad feels from seeing me and my siblings together getting on as adults. Us all getting along and enjoying each other's company is a great source of meaning for him. But if I were to invite him up here on stage today and ask him why he finds it meaningful, I'm not sure he'd be able to give you an answer. He'd say something like, I don't know, it just is. We can identify things which are meaningful, but we can't explain why they're meaningful. We lack a meta-meaning. And interestingly, though we can't explain why our lives are meaningful, we also don't like being told our lives are meaningless. There is a hunger for meaning. There is a hunger for either wanting what we do here and now to really matter, or a hunger at least to be involved in something that outlasts us. Okay, what on earth has this got to do with our main topic today? Well, when interrogating suffering, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche made this really interesting observation. And he said that actually what arouses indignation over suffering is not the suffering itself, it's the senselessness of it. And he explains it like this. He says something was lacking. Humanity did not know how to justify, to account for, to explain himself. He suffered from the problem of his meaning. Other things made him suffer, but the suffering itself was not his problem. Instead, it was the fact there was no answer to the question that he screamed, why do I suffer? The meaninglessness of suffering, not the suffering, was the curse that has so far blanketed mankind. So actually Friedrich Nietzsche has a bit of a reputation for being something of a despairing nihilist, but actually Friedrich Nietzsche found great joy in life, and he thought that human beings were a strong and hardy species who were capable of dealing with and bearing with suffering. But what makes suffering so unbearable is not the suffering itself, it's the fact that we don't have a meaning for it. It's senseless, it's pointless. We suffer, but the suffering's not the worst thing. It's the fact that we don't have a reason for it. Even taking COVID-19 into account, the 21st century West is one of the safest societies to live in the entire history of the human race. Good healthcare, low infant mortality rates, very low industrial deaths. And yet it is the most prone to be overwhelmed by the existence of suffering. We can't fathom the idea of God existing in the face of suffering in the face of suffering, but we forget that belief in the existence of God was almost the default position even prior to the discovery of anesthetics. People in the past suffered far more than we do, but they found no conflict between their suffering and the existence of God. And what I want to suggest is the kind of combination of Loic Ferry and Nietzsche's idea goes some way to explaining why we feel suffering so profoundly in the West. It's not the suffering itself, because we suffer objectively far less than our forebears, and even comparatively to other cultures around the globe today. But we lack this meta-meaning. We can't articulate why our lives are meaningful, and as a result, we acutely feel the senselessness of suffering. We lack an overarching meaning, and so when we suffer, it seems senseless to us. Secondly, to talk of suffering as a problem has already begun to frame how we think about the issue. And to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to paint some very broad brushstrokes about how different worldviews approach suffering. And in painting broad brushstrokes, inevitably you miss some of the nuance. So if what I say comes across as lacking nuance, for that I apologise in advance. Generally you have Eastern philosophies, many of which have either Hindu or Buddhist underpinnings. In Buddhism, suffering is called dukkha, or in Hinduism it would be called samsara. And for Buddhists, dukkha, suffering, is the reality of life. And the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism are in effect a step-by-step guide on how to alleviate suffering. And they go a little something like this. It says that all life is suffering. We suffer because we crave, we have desire and we have attachments. And to stop suffering, we must stop craving. We must free ourselves from desire and attachments. And to stop craving, we must follow the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is, I won't spell it out for you, but it's the 8 facets of what a good life is. And these Four Noble Truths are kind of wrapped up with the notion of karma, that your actions and your choices in this incarnation of your life will affect you in the next. And so to be very reductionistic about it, in Buddhism, in some sense, if you are suffering, it's in some sense your fault. Either your behaviour in a past life is now affecting you, or the reason you're suffering today is because you still have desires and attachments and cravings. You're suffering because you haven't freed yourself from desire. Buddhism doesn't deny the existence of pain, but where pain transforms into suffering is when you desire to not be in pain. The desire to be freed from pain rather than accepting pain for what it is, that is what causes suffering. And ultimately, until you've completed enough incarnations of your life, until you've totally freed yourself from desires and cravings, you will suffer. And that's on you. Why has this happened to me? Buddhism says it's because we've not mastered this detachment from our desire to not be in pain. Moving from the east more to the west, you have a view like naturalism, physicalism, that this life is all there is. We are mere specks of dust in comparison to the infinitude of the universe. Human beings are the outcome of blind, evolutionary processes that operate without goal or purpose. We're not part of some divine plan. We are here today, we are gone tomorrow. The universe owes us nothing. As the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky articulates in his work, Notes from the Underground. He says, nature doesn't ask your permission, it doesn't care about your wishes, or whether you like its laws or not. You're obliged to accept it as it is, and consequently, all its results as well. Primo Levi was a Jewish writer who spent a year as a prisoner in the concentration camp in Auschwitz. And at one point in his time there, he was desperately thirsty, and outside his hut was an icicle hanging from the roof. And he reached out for it, thinking, oh, it's going to be like a cold, free, refreshing drink. And as he snapped the icicle off the roof, a guard saw him and wrenched the icicle out of his hand and smashed it onto the floor. And instinctively, Levi cried out, "Why? Why have you done this?" To which the guard replied to him, "Here, there is no why." under a naturalistic framework, that is what discussions about suffering ultimately amount to. We can ask why, but at bottom, there is no why. Suffering just is. As the journalist, prominent atheist Christopher Hitchens quipped as he was dying of cancer, he said, to the dumb question, why me? The cosmos barely bothers to reply in return. Why not? Broadly speaking, under Eastern philosophies, the answer to the question of why in suffering is, it's your fault. It's your fault. Under the naturalistic view, suffering isn't a problem, so to speak. In a naturalistic framework, to ask why is to fail to understand your place in the universe. It's to fail to understand the universe does not care about you. Suffering isn't a problem. Suffering just is. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't find either of those answers particularly satisfactory. How can I sincerely believe that those who suffer with hunger only suffer because they've not detached themselves from their desire to eat? How can I believe the suffering is their own fault? But how can I really believe that existential cry that wells up from inside all human beings going through suffering? Why? Why has this happened to me? How can I really believe that such a ubiquitous question is a stupid one? Especially when it feels so poignant, especially when it feels so meaningful. It is so hard for us to know what sense there might be in our suffering. But I find it much harder to say that it's senseless. The fact that suffering hurts, the fact that it makes it seem like something worth getting angry about, to me only makes sense if there is a loving God in the picture. For our pain to mean anything, there must be a God in the picture. So for Christians, suffering is a problem. It is a problem. How do you square suffering with a loving God? It's a problem for sure, but at least it is a problem. And one of the most refreshing things I find about my faith is that it never treats my pain like a one-liner to sweep underneath the carpet. It doesn't provide a knee-jerk reaction. It doesn't simplify or nullify my hard questions. The Christian faith sees suffering as a problem, and it sees it as a problem to be taken seriously. There's a whole book in the Bible called the Book of Job, which is engaged in doing just this. It's a book that refuses to give neat and pithy answers to suffering. You know, Job's friends, they come around and they offer him all the answers that you might have heard before from well-meaning people. Well, maybe this is just cosmic justice, you know, calm as a bitch, you're going to have to deal. Or, everything happens for a reason. However, you probably full well know that for those undergoing deep emotional turmoil, trite answers hold no weight. You telling a grieving loved one that I know you can't think of one, but maybe there's a good reason for your suffering, that does not cut the mustard. The Bible doesn't offer us neat answers to questions of suffering because there are no neat answers to questions of suffering. To existential cries of despair, there is never a one-line-fits-all solution. Instead, what we see in the Christian faith and we see in the Bible is one that gives voice to our suffering. It doesn't try and tell us that it's our fault. It doesn't try and tell us that asking why is a dumb question. What we see in the Bible is the existential question, why? Why is this happening to me? We see that question come from the very lips of God himself. And on your tables you have got this book here. It's called Uncover Mark. It's written by a guy called Mark, and it's a biography of the life of Jesus. And if you want to read along with me, if you turn to page number 86. That's page number 86. I'm going to read from verse 33. So it's the little number 33 below the heading, the death of Jesus. And it says this: At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? At this point, Jesus is being executed on a Roman cross. When some of those standing near heard this, they say, listen, he's calling out to Elijah. Some ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. And with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. My God, why have you forsaken me? Here, the Bible paints a picture of Jesus, God in the flesh, undergoing physical, emotional, spiritual torment, and what comes from his lips? Echoes of our own tortured cries of suffering. Why? Why have you forsaken me? The God of the universe is not aloof to suffering, but has entered into it himself. The God of the universe identifies with those who suffer. But I want you to notice something interesting. Jesus is on the cross, he is bearing the weight of the sin of the world, he's experiencing excruciating physical pain and spiritual anguish to restore the broken relationship between God and humanity. But Jesus knows that. Jesus knows exactly why he's on the cross. So when Jesus asks, why? In some sense, his question doesn't make sense. Jesus knows why he's there. Why is he asking why? Unless his question of why isn't actually what it seems. Because what if Jesus isn't actually asking for an explanation of his suffering? I mean, when you're suffering, when you are really suffering, and you cry out to the heavens, why is this happening to me? Do you actually want an answer? If someone, rocked up to you and said, oh, the reason you're suffering is because da-da-da-da-da, and they were right, would you actually feel any better? Would that make it any more bearable? Or maybe, like Jesus on the cross, our cry of why is not a cry for answers, but it's a demand to know that we're being heard. A cry that demands to know whether we are alone in our suffering. And the resounding message of the Christian faith is no. No, we are not. No, we are not alone. The Bible takes suffering seriously because the central claim of the Christian faith is that God himself has experienced it. Look at the nails driven through his hands and his feet. God is intimately acquainted with suffering. And in the midst of our pain and sorrow and suffering, the reason that I can trust God in suffering is that I know he knows what it is to suffer. To suffer physically, to suffer emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Jesus gets it. He gets it. Sure, in my faith, maybe I don't always get an answer. Maybe I don't always get an explanation, but I don't get told it's my fault, and I don't get told my suffering is pointless. At the end of the book of Job, God doesn't give Job an answer to Job's cries of why. What Job gets is an encounter with God. When we cry why, God doesn't give us an answer. He gives us himself. What we get is the intimacy that comes from a father-child relationship. What we get are arms that embrace. We get shoulders that are broad enough to bear our doubts, and a chest that is strong enough to withstand our tear-stoked fists as we beat against it. But the story doesn't end there. Though where we left the story, Jesus breathes his last breath and dies on the cross. The claim of the Christian faith is that Jesus rose again from the cold tomb that he was laid in. And he promises to do the same to all who put their trust in him. Like a needle punching through cloth and pulling a thread through to the other side, Jesus promises to raise us to eternal life with no more pain, no more tears, no more suffering. And in comparison to the ocean of eternity that lay ahead, our suffering here will be a small, forgotten drop. I've mentioned the philosopher Loic Ferry already, and I'll mention him again. Ferry is an atheist, but on the question of suffering, he sees the answer offered by the Christian faith as far superior to all the other alternatives. And he thinks that one of the reasons that the Christian faith and belief in a loving God exists despite suffering is because of the hope it offers to others. Ferry had this to say. He says the Christian response is without question the most effective of all the responses. It would seem to be the only version of salvation that enables not only to transcend the fear of death, but beat death itself. For Ferry, he's not a Christian because he doesn't see a good enough reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Though, come back on Friday and I'll be going through some good reasons that we do have to believe that it's true. But the message of the Christian faith is that with Jesus, our suffering is not senseless. And though we may not understand all the whys, all the hows, all the wherefores, walking down the path of suffering is following in the footsteps of Jesus himself. And an encounter with the crucified and resurrected God not only offers us comfort in our pain, but meaning for today and hope for the future, that death and pain will not have the final word. And for me, and for billions of Christians throughout the world and throughout history, that has been how we make sense of our suffering. Because we're not alone. We are deeply, deeply loved. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for all you've said on a difficult topic. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Please do continue to ask your questions about suffering. So our first question, yes, but why? Isn't it okay to expect that an all-powerful God should have a reason for what happens?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I suppose what I'd like to differentiate between there being a reason and us knowing a reason. So like if you take it from a purely philosophical point of view, what we're faced with is what we call an omniscient God, a God who knows all things. And when we suffer, the reason that we see a disconnect between this all-loving God is because we can't think of a good reason for our suffering. And naturally, humans are very good at thinking of things, so if we can't think of a reason, we go, well, there isn't one there. And so when I say, we look at the Bible and we don't get answers, what I'm saying, I'm not saying that there isn't a reason. What I'm saying is that we find that we don't know. And that, yes, it is okay to expect that an all-powerful God should have reasons for what happens. Yes, it's 100% okay for it to accept that. Because I think that is what is the case. And where the Christian faith is very much a faith is that it's akin to trust. Like, I think people think faith of this blind leap into the dark, where you're not really sure what it is you're getting yourself into. But I want you to imagine faith. Imagine that you are a resistance fighter in France in 1941, and you want to fight against the Nazi regime, and you meet the local leader of the resistance movement. You meet him in a pub somewhere, I don't know, and he tells you all the plans, right? Here's what's going to happen, here's what's going on, here's what's going on, gives you all his contacts. Implicitly now, by meeting this man, you're in danger with the Nazi regime. You have to have this man's trust. You have to trust him now. He's revealed himself to you, you believe, and you trust in what he says, you believe he's the real deal. Okay, now 2 weeks later, you see the same man, dressed in SS uniform, rounding up one of your other resistance fighters. Now you've got two options. You can go up to the Nazis and say, hang on, I met this guy, he said he's a resistance fighter and he made me join the resistance movement. Well, obviously no, you can't do that. So what do? Do you rat him out? Or do you trust him? He's revealed to you that he's the real deal. Maybe what's going on here is something more than you can see. And you don't see it, but you can imagine the analogy that he rounds up one of your resistance fighters and then round the corner he lets them go. You don't see that. And for me, that is how I liken my faith. Are there good reasons? Yes, there has to be. But I'm content in knowing that I don't think I'll ever find them out in this life, because I trust the character of the crucified God.
Yeah, that's really helpful. The other question is very, very similar, about logic. If Christianity isn't able to answer why, like we're not addressing logic, then how can it make sense?
Ooh, very good question. Sorry, let me just read it so I make sure that I know exactly what it is you've asked. So Christianity makes sense, suffering, able to answer why, how, etc. I suppose again this speaks into the omniscience of God. Like the Christian faith and Scripture not providing you with an answer again is not the same thing as saying there isn't an answer. But in compared to all of the other worldviews that I explored, it's the only one that, in some sense, asking why is a question that makes sense. If there's no logic, how can it make sense? I suppose for even the question why to make sense, there has to be an alternative way it could have been. Where in the naturalistic world, well, this world is all there is, there's not going to be an alternative. In more Eastern philosophies, the answer is why, is it's your fault. So if you want to say, well, there's a reason, but it's not my fault, you kind of need to have something of an omniscient, loving God. That's not a satisfying answer. I'm going to be sitting at that table until people leave me alone, so please come and approach me.
Yeah, do stick around and continue to put your questions in. This question is on a slightly different tack, but we've looked at Uncover, which is a bit of the Bible. So with many translations of the Bible, that also led to many interpretations. If there are so many interpretations, how can you be sure that what it says is not corrupted?
Yeah, really good question. And the cop-out answer would be, I'm giving a talk on exactly this on Friday afternoon, so why don't you come to that? And what I'll do is, I don't know if it's still at the bookstall, but at least there was yesterday when I looked. There's a red and yellow book by a man called Peter J. Williams called Can We Trust the Gospels? And it's written by a New Testament scholar from Cambridge, and he gives a whole load of reasons of why the Gospel accounts are trustworthy. And one of the ones that he gives, it's a really obscure answer. Well, it's kind of niche. But if you imagine that texts are corrupted, the further the people who are corrupting the texts are from the original events, you'll start to make mistakes and make mistakes and assumptions about a culture that you're not familiar with. So, for example, if someone was trying to, write the events of what was going on today, but didn't really understand our culture, you'd expect them to use names that maybe people at our time wouldn't use. If everyone in the room was called, I don't know, Meredith, apologies if you're called Meredith. If everyone in the room was called Meredith, you'd realise that the people who were writing it didn't really understand the culture because everyone at the time wasn't called Meredith. However, when you look in the names used in the New Testament and then you compare those to names that are used in Greek literature outside the New Testament and in Hebrew literature outside the New Testament, you find that the percentage of names actually marries up quite well. That the frequency of the names that you see written in Scripture match up with the frequency of the names that people had at the time. And that is something you would only really expect if the people who were writing were familiar with the culture that they were writing about. Something that you wouldn't expect if the text had been corrupted over years and years and years. But come back on Friday, I'll have a lot more meaningful to say about that.
And so just one final question. Many people find a satisfactory answer to why we suffer in science. So what makes Christianity's answer better? I suppose I don't know if we do.
maybe this is me being a bit facetious, but for me, science doesn't really offer an account of, maybe can it explain, what our suffering is. Oh, we're suffering because we're hungry, or we're suffering because we have, synapses are firing that are stimulating certain parts of our brain which are making us respond in a certain way. Sure, it can explain suffering in that sense, but is that really an explanation of suffering? I would argue no, that the cry that we have in suffering, it's not so much, I wonder how this is kind of working chemically, wonder how this is working, neurologically. It's far more than that. And in that sense, I don't think science can account for really what we mean by suffering. It can give us an explanation of how it interacts with our bodies, but for me that's not quite the same as how we experience it in our inner being. And what makes Christianity's answer better is not that it denies what science says about suffering, but it offers a fuller picture, where science will sketch out the bare bones of, right, here's neurologically, chemically, hormonally how suffering works. Christianity goes, okay, and here's where there might be meaning in this. And I think that's why Christianity's answer is better, because it offers a fuller picture.
Chris, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. Please do stick around on your tables and keep chatting with each other about these things.
Yeah.